The second sponsor of the show is TravCon, the Travelers Conference. I'm super excited to announce them as a sponsor of the show. TravCon was there for me before I got started as a medical nomad, and now I'm actually involved with the planning of the event. So super aligned, super congruent. I've been promoting them before they were even a sponsor, and so I'm excited to have them on. So there are three main reasons that you should go to TravCon this year. Number one, value. This is the cheapest conference to go to as a medical professional. And also the only place that I've ever felt like royalty when you're walking in and all these staffing agencies and all these recruiters want to talk to you and you're bumping elbows with these travelers and they're interested about your story, about where you're coming from and what you're doing. And it's overall just a really good feel-good event. Number two is education and growth. So this conference was founded on the realization that there's a lot to know to be a medical traveler, to be a medical nomad. And so this is where you go to get the most updated tax information. This is where you go for those really niche specific questions on what's it like to travel in an RV and what's it like to travel to Hawaii. And then third, community. This is where a lot of my traveler friends that are very near and dear to my heart right now, this is where we met. So this is where the relationship sparked. It's also one of the only places that you get to go to and see the leaders and meet the leaders of the industry, both on the staffing agency side and on the traveler side, and also get to meet your recruiters face-to-face that you've been working with. So TravCon is always in September every year. TravCon is also always in Las Vegas. The link is going to be in the show notes for you to get your ticket. I'll be at TravCon. All my friends will be at TravCon. I hope to see you there.
This episode of the New Medical Nomads podcast is brought to you by Nomadicare. Now, personally, I love Nomadicare. I've used Nomadicare, and I recommend the company to all new travelers. What Nomadicare does is it takes the fear out of getting set up with a bad recruiter, which is the biggest fear that you have jumping into this journey. So they sit down, they interview recruiters, they vet them, get them on a list, and then provide them to you as a free service, as a free recruiter matchmaking service in order to get you started on your journey. Now, usually you only get 2 recruiters going through Nomadicare, but being a listener of the show, you can get 3. So this is how it's going to work. You go to nomadicare.com/Dylan. You will get set up with 3 recruiters to be on your dream team, as well as a guide to get you started on your journey.
Hey Nomads, this is Dylan coming at you from my friend's flower shop. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of the New Medical Nomads podcast. I am your host, Dr. Dylan Callier, and I am currently back home, which is kind of funny. Because the hardest place for me to get cell service and internet is actually back home. So I am currently in town, away from the chickens, away from the cows, with some internet access in order to record this. And we are continuing on the negotiation series. And for those of you who've been listening, are probably like, yes, finally some actionable information that I can take moving forward, because up until now, it's been very much setting the stage and me talking about why I think this is so important and how to think about things. And so since the last episode, there has been a little bit of a hiatus of me recording. And during that time, I've actually got to learn a lot. And some of the things that I used to think when I actually started this series, I've changed my mind on. And before, when I started this podcast, when I wasn't a traveler yet, and meeting all these other travelers and seeing them online and seeing travelers getting, taken advantage of, travelers being exploited, not earning the amount they should have been earning, finding out from other persons that other travelers at the facility they're actually making much, much more. And I came into this thinking like, wow, like there is so much like hesitancy and there's so much empathy in all these travelers, and they're just kind of getting taken advantage of. We really need to be aggressive. We need to stand up and not go for this. And now that I'm a seasoned traveler, I do feel that way. But I've also noticed that there are travelers out there that are on the very opposite end of that spectrum, that come off as entitled, that aren't very well educated on what the market can support. And so the sharks aren't only in the recruiters, but you can also have sharks as a traveler. And if you are going, I used to think like, oh, if you wanted to go these hardcore, like hardball negotiations, that's something you wanted to do, you could do that and you could still have a successful travel career. And the more I meet and the more relationships I build within this community, within this traveler industry, I'm realizing that if you are a shark as a traveler, you might have a successful contract, but you're not going to have a successful travel career, because it really takes the relationships between you and your dream team recruiters, in that trust, in order to really have that successful career. If you're a recruiter hopper, you're kind of bouncing around, you don't really have a core three, you don't really spend much time with one recruiter, maybe it's, you only spend one contract with the recruiter and then you move on, just whichever ends up having the higher offer. You don't get that trust with that recruiter. And so when an VIP facility comes along, maybe it's really high paying, maybe it's really cool location, values not only just in the money. If you're not on the top of that recruiter's list, you're not going to be thought of for that position. So if you were really wanting to go to Orlando, Florida, if you really want to go to New York City, if you're really wanting to go to San Diego, and it's very rare there, and you don't have a solid relationship with your dream team three, with those recruiters, they're going to give that opportunity to somebody else before you. And so I really, really want to bring home that this industry is really founded on relationships and finding the ones that you can trust. And not only does that trust kind of affect us and who we work with, but it's also going to affect who that recruiter works with and who they offer the really cool opportunities to, and who they trust in order to show up, not cancel, different things like that. And so you can definitely negotiate 100%. And that's what we're going to be covering today with kind of the basic parts of contract, and how to negotiate. But I do think that there's some finesse with it. I do think that there's a way to come across where you're not really hardcore about it, where you're not frictional, where you're not making, the recruiter kind of step back, that there's a way to ask for more and to find that really good win for you as a traveler without burning bridges and without disrupting that relationship. And so a lot of that comes with education and just being in the area of the travel groups and kind of learning, finding out, listening. If you're listening to podcasts, you're already kind of in the top 80 to 90% of knowing what's going on. And, reading up on blogs, because there's so many travelers out there that don't do their own research. You meet them at TravCon, a traveler's been doing it for 3 years, has no idea what a tax home is. Oh my goodness. But there are definitely some things and a way to do it to where you're not going to put yourself at jeopardy at not having a successful travel career. And what's tough too is that with those sharks, you don't really know if that's going on, right? Because a recruiter's not going to tell you like, oh, by the way, that place you were really wanting actually popped up, and you're kind of a brat, and I don't want to give this position to you because it's a VIP client. We want to make them happy so that they use this again, and we don't want them to have to deal with a personality that's kind of been come across as you have. They're not going to know that. And so it's kind of like hidden under the rug. Same thing if it's with a big company, an MSP, and you're kind of on the no-go list from a previous cancellation. MSP is never going to tell the client that, or never going to tell the staffing agency that. And so you're going to show up applying for this job, and they're just going to, say, oh, like you didn't get it. And you're not really going to know if you're a shark. And so it's a little tough with that, but I do think that with all the steps here with these upcoming episodes, you'll be able to negotiate effectively, and then also do it without burning bridges, and with setting boundaries, with being kind and polite, but not causing friction, which is the ultimate win-win. There's a little bit of communication here, and we're all healthcare travelers, and I know we're very, very good at communication education. And so I'm expecting that most of the nomads out there will be able to handle this very, very well. And so first part of negotiations is kind of knowing what you can negotiate. In general, almost everything is negotiable, but if it's coming from kind of an MSP, and then you have the subcontractor, which is the smaller staffing agency that you're working with, there are some parts that are, less negotiable, things like that. So in general, if you have a question on something, you can always ask, but these are like the main the main ones that usually pop up within a negotiation. So I'm just going to run down the list, talk about each. If you are not driving and listening, if you're watching on YouTube, thanks for joining. You can kind of see the background of my friend's flower shop here, and we're going to be working through each kind of step. So the first thing I wanted to hit on for looking at a contract, and the first thing you can negotiate is like start dates and end dates. Usually start dates, they like them on Mondays, just because that's kind of how the world works. But if you were coming from another contract, you can always negotiate a little bit later. Time off during a contract. You can get time off. When I was first getting into traveling, I didn't think that you could get any time off, right? You just, if you got sick, you just didn't show up, and that was kind of it. But you're there to work, and they're not going to allow you to take any time off. But that's actually false. If you are working a standard 5-day a week, 8-hour day, usually up to like 5 days, you can ask off without any pushback. If you are doing like 3 12-hour shifts, usually you can ask for 3 of those 12-hour shifts off. Usually they don't like it all to be within the same week, but so you might get pushback on that. But usually around that limit during a 13-week normal contract, you should be fine. If you do experience pushback, say you're trying to ask off for TravCon, you got a sister's wedding coming up, nephew's birthday party, whatever it might be, something fun going on, maybe it's just a hike, like go hike. If you need more time off than that, or you are experiencing pushback, one of the things that has been really successful for me is to add an additional week at the end of the contract. So if there's something that I really, really want to make, there's not really anything that I want to cut out, maybe there's several important things that I want to do, I will offer an additional week at the end to my recruiter and say, hey, if they do give me this time off, I would be happy to work an extra week. I'd be happy to work 2 extra weeks to say thank you and show them that I appreciate it. And that has been a trick that I've used before in order to make sure that I get the dates off that I want for whatever it might be. Again, birthdays, important events, weddings, back home, stuff that's going to actually take some travel time. But that's something I've done. If it's less than a 13-week contract, because those are out there, maybe it's a short maternity leave, something like that, might experience some more pushback just because they need somebody during that short amount of time. And it also depends on how lucrative the contract is. If it's a really competitive area, maybe they don't really need it. Usually the more competitive areas will be asking for 6 months anyhow. But yeah, definitely being willing and being flexible in order to add a week at the end. You can get those dates off that you want. And then always if they're like, no, we're just wanting you to work straight through, those things are really, really important to you. You don't have to take it. You can always go to the next contract. For the next one to look at is guaranteed hours. Usually this isn't necessarily put forth by the facility. It can be, and it can be reflected forward into the staffing agency, but a lot of times it's just the staffing agency and them guaranteeing hours to allow you to feel more comfortable with actually taking the position, and for you to feel like you have some comfort and that there's less of a risk of you driving all the way across the US, flying up to Alaska, wherever it might be. Guaranteed hours per week. If it's a 3-day shift during the week and 12 hours, usually like 36 hours is really good to see. 36 hours in general is really, really nice to see. Once it gets down to 32 hours per week guaranteed, that would probably be my bare minimum, but that's also because my market's hot right now. And I know that if this contract won't do it, the next contract will. If you are in a market where it's a little bit colder, I'm thinking like site nurses or maybe therapy assistants, you might see more and more contracts with a lower amount of guaranteed hours. Maybe it's only 25. And if that happens, I would definitely ask the recruiter if they've had any experience with that facility in the past, and just ask if they've usually canceled before, or if they've actually, that's just kind of in the contract and they always hit 40 hours a week. And then you can also follow up on the interview and ask, hey, have you had a traveler before? How often have you canceled? moving forward? Do you anticipate like needing me 40 hours? Are we getting ready to hit a slow part of the year? I just ask those questions, and then you're always listening to their voice and kind of feeling them out. And if there's any like hesitation, that kind of gives it away if if they're actually thinking that. Or maybe you have a straightforward person that'll be able to tell you like, oh, actually, we're getting ready for a slow part of the season. Historically, last year we kind of did this, and it only went back to like 30, 32 hours for our contractors. And it just gives you a better idea on what to expect. But if you're in a hot market, 36 to 40 is like golden. 32 would be okay, and then anything below that, I would try to ask higher. Now, if say the facility only guarantees 25 hours a week, and you can still negotiate higher. It would just be that the staffing agency is taking that risk. So in the event that you only work 25 hours a week, and in your contract between you and the staffing agency, you have 32 in there, that means that they're going to take that difference. They're going to take that 7 hours of pay to you, and then that's going to be coming out of their margins. So that would be coming out of the staffing agency's pocket, not the facilities, not the travelers, but the staffing agency. So just know that it's not always the facility that actually has those rules. It can be the staffing agency, and some will actually go above their own contract with that facility in order to make sure that you feel comfortable and that you're going to get those guaranteed hours in order to take that position. The other thing to look at would be the amount of notice before a contract cancellation. So contracts can cancel on you. Usually it's with a reason. Either you and the facility just didn't get along, or normally if the facility cancels because they found a permanent worker to actually work. And just a quick tip, travelers actually cancel on facilities way more often than facilities cancel on travelers. I know it doesn't seem like that with all the groups online and everybody saying that the facility canceled on them, but travelers by far are the ones that will cancel on the facilities. And so that does really put a bummer in a really hard hit to staffing agencies. Usually the staffing agencies are the ones caught in the middle of this. And if that happens, you can, lose trust with that, not only that staffing agency, not only that MSP, but with that recruiter. And again, we're just talking about your success as a traveler throughout your whole career. You want to limit those cancellations as much as possible and only do them if absolutely necessary. Only do them if you feel your license at jeopardy, things like that, some serious stuff, because canceling early can really hurt your ability to get jobs later on. But with the amount of notice, if you are working at a hospital, usually we are seeing a trend of hospitals moving more towards just a 2-week notice. If you are working more in like an independent facility, you can get the 30 days. So if you're a therapist, if you're kind of working in an outpatient center as a nurse, a lot of times you can get those 30-day guarantees. And I would always shoot for a 30-day guarantee. If it's only 2 weeks, you can make that decision if it's worth it. If you're already in the area, maybe a 2-week notice isn't that big of a deal. But if you're, again, flying to Alaska, if you're driving across the US and you get there and ta-da, you get your 2-week notice right away, then that can really put you in a hole as for your housing. So if you buy, you got your temporary housing and they require a 30-day notice, but your facility only needs a 2-week notice, then you're a week or two in the hole for owing money to that rental housing. And so when you're buying housing, if you only have a 2-week notice, that's something to keep in mind. And maybe you can work something out with the owner, or kind of let them know ahead of time, be like, hey, what would happen if I end up like having to leave in 2 weeks? Would that really put you in a bind? Could we find somebody? Could I help you find somebody? Just different things to think of, because although it's not, again, facilities aren't the ones that cancel the most often, facilities do cancel. And if your market is lower, if the market is more cold and there's more competition and there's a lot of travelers out there for those few jobs, the amount of facility cancellations do go up, because if it's more competitive, there's more persons willing to take a permanent job as well, and that they can go that route. And so just keep yourself safe. Always keep that in mind, that if you do have less than a 30-day guarantee, to just make sure that you can try and reflect that within the rental properties that you get, or not rental properties, but your housing, your temporary housing. All right. So now talking about kind of the different types of buckets that there can be within a contract. The two big categories are going to be your taxable and your non-taxable. Your taxable hourly is determined by the facility. Typically, what we've learned throughout the industry standard is between 18 to 22. That is a number quoted by Travel Tax and Joseph Smith at TravCon. But there are professions out there that go a little bit lower than that. So if you are seeing lower than that, it might just be that your profession can go lower. If your profession doesn't necessarily make a higher amount for hourly, then it can dip lower, but below that 18 mark. And this is all decided within the staffing agency's legal team. So they will ultimately decide how risky they want to be with how low they want to drop. Because as travelers, the risk is making sure that we have a tax home and proving that we have a tax home. So that's on us. The part that is on the staffing agencies is making sure that they're not paying us too low of taxable wages to where it comes off as wage recharacterization, which would be a big no-no to the IRS. And so that's for their legal team to decide. You are never in control of how much you get for your taxable hourly. The company is always the one that ultimately gives the stamp of approval. So you don't have to worry about that. With your income returns at the end of the year, you just kind of write it on there. They don't ask what you earned hourly. They're just asking for a total amount that you earned that year. And if it's lower, they don't ask how many months out of the year that you worked either. It's just, hey, I made less this year. Maybe I took a trip wherever and I just didn't work as much. And so that never falls on the traveler. What does fall on the traveler is the tax homes and knowing the rules and being able to prove that you are returning to your home and that you are duplicating expenses and things like that. But the hourly pay is on the staffing agency. And so that's a little bit about the taxable hourly. For the other bucket, the other big category is the non-taxable items. And so I'll kind of walk through what the non-taxable items are. And so the first one would be per diems. Per diems are usually split up into two different settings. There's housing and then there's meals and incidentals. These are ultimately capped by the GSA. You can go to gsa.gov and kind of see what is capped for the area that you're going to go, and it's seasonal because so just because you're there, in August, wherever you're going, maybe San Francisco, just because you're there in August doesn't necessarily mean the cap will be the same in December. There might be a big tourism spike. There might be reasons, there might be weather patterns that affect the amount of living. And so the government will actually say, okay, over time, we kind of see this, and this is the cap, or this is what we usually see for average expenditures. Anything over this, you're going to have to show and prove to us that you should have been getting that tax-free money from the staffing agency. You can go to gsa.gov. It's all there just to make sure that you're not going over that limit. A lot of, or I would say most staffing agencies won't really toe the line with that. They might get close, but they never give you the max. And a lot of times the bill rate just doesn't support the max anyhow, or the amount that you can earn as a traveler doesn't really support hitting that max. Usually there's some other options to make sure they're not getting as close to the max, because that will potentially trigger some eyes later on to be looking at what's actually going on with these payments. So housing should usually be higher than your meals and incidentals. The suggestion I was given, again, coming back from TrapCon, was housing should be around like 2/3, and then meals and incidentals should be around 1/3 for the amount of non-taxable that you're owning, or the non-taxable that you're receiving for those per diems. Again, that the tax laws are very gray within the travel industry. So all this is per interpretation. I do not interpretate. I just interpretate. I don't interpret the law. I just do what I'm told by people who can do that. So that is it for the per diems. There's really just two options, and usually they kind of come across like that on the contract. After that is the travel reimbursement. Travel reimbursement, from all of the staffing agencies that I've seen so far, travel reimbursement 100% comes out of the traveler's bucket of money. It's not coming from the staffing agency. This is actually different when you look at licensure reimbursement, which we'll talk about here next. But travel reimbursement is almost always, everything I've seen so far always comes from the traveler's paycheck. So if a company says, yes, we'll provide travel reimbursement, sometimes they front load that and you get it in the first week on the first paycheck. Sometimes they backload it, you get it on the last paycheck. Sometimes they split it. So maybe it's a to travel reimbursement and there's a from travel reimbursement. The risk on the staffing agency would be to give you a large reimbursement on the first contract, because they don't know if your contract is going to go the full 13 weeks. Maybe something happens, maybe you get sick, whatever, maybe the facility cancels. If now instead of working all 13 weeks, you're only working 8, that's a hit on their money in order to provide that big lump sum amount at the front of your contract. So it is a little bit of a risk for them. If you have any type of reimbursement that's kind of held towards the end, that's more of a risk on you, because they can always prorate that amount. It's a little more fair because then if you only work 8 out of 13 weeks, you still get your travel reimbursement for what's supported by that amount given to you by a hospital, but it is now prorated because you're not working that amount. And so prorated would be like if you were getting 1,300, so like 100 a week for every contract. Now it's shortened to 8 weeks. Now you get 800 instead for whatever that reimbursement might be. Usually travel reimbursements front loaded, and that's the one I usually see the most. And then sometimes they split it up in the front and in the end. But that is it for travel reimbursement. And then you can always ask for travel reimbursement too. So something to note with the year of 2019 is that with these new tax laws that went through, we can't ask for extra deductions as a W-2 employee, which you are as a traveler. So we're not a standard or a typical contractor. We're 1099 and we can write off our own deductions. But you are a W-2, if you're a typical traveler going through a staffing agency, you're probably a W-2. You are unable to write off any of these extra expenses anymore. So if a staffing agency only gave you your per diems and your taxable hourly, which is totally possible. I've received contracts like that. They're usually really straightforward. The staffing agencies like doing that because there's less risk on them. They're not front loading everything. Everybody kind of win-win in that situation. But if, say, I had a bunch of travel, maybe I had a really expensive car ride over to that area, and it wasn't providing me in a reimbursement, I can't then write that off later on that year in order to get some tax money back. So now, if it's not paid to you for tax-free money, you really don't have an option to get those tax deductions. What this means for staffing agencies, and what will likely continue to happen, is that now the amount that you would receive as a traveler is going to stay the same, but they're going to put it in different buckets to make it look more lucrative. So it's ultimately going to be the same amount of money, but it will come across as, oh wow, I'm getting travel reimbursement. I'm getting licensure reimbursement. I'm getting these per diems. They're also reimbursing me for my CEU, and they're also reimbursing me for my scrubs. I'm winning when you add it all up, it's actually the same for that contract that I would have been before. So it's going to seem more lucrative, and like you're getting more out of it because there's more lines on the ledger. But when you actually add it up, the lines are just a little bit smaller, and it's the same. So it all comes out of one place. It's all coming out of your bucket of money. You have a lot of say in where that ends up getting put, just to make sure that if you do have some extra left over, that you're not going to decide to put it in the taxable hourly part, that you get to decide to put it in a non-taxable bucket. So travel reimbursement is a great way to do that if you would like to. The next one to talk about would be licensure reimbursement. And this one's really different between all staffing agencies. And so whereas travel reimbursement is pretty straightforward, travel reimbursement almost always comes directly from the traveler's bucket of money. Licensure reimbursement can vary differently between staffing agencies. So maybe one staffing agency, they take that licensure reimbursement 100% from your bucket of money, and then they give it to you as a way to receive tax-free compensation. Another company might take that licensure reimbursement 100% from their own money as a perk to you. And another company might do half and half. Maybe half is coming from your bucket of money, and then they match the other half. And so this is a really important question to ask your recruiter, and to know if this is actually coming from the staffing agency or if it's coming from your money. The reason being, when you do negotiate for a contract extension, you want to know how much of that license reimbursement can be put back into the contract for the next one. Or if it's 100% from their own bucket of money, you wouldn't be able to ask for that money back in extension. Same thing for when it comes to factoring in like overtime and extra time, which we'll get here in a little bit. You want to know how much of that is actually coming from the staffing agency and how much is coming from your bucket of money. It can also be very nice if, say, you're going up to California and there's a company that pays 100% for the licensure, and California is really expensive. And if it's your first time out there and you get it within a certain amount of time, and you play by all the rules, you now just got a really expensive licensure paid for you without it coming out and affecting your cash. So that can be a really cool benefit if you're going to a new state that they'll cover it. So that might be a deciding factor. If you're talking with two different companies, they both approach you with the same job, and you're wondering which is better, and they both have licensure reimbursement the same amount. One might be 100% coming from the staffing agency, and then the other one, it might be coming from your bucket of money. And if that's the case, then you could go with that staffing company that's going to be paying for your licensure instead of it touching your pay, and then you would come out ahead relatively for those two contracts. So those are all the main ones. There are some ones that can, if you kind of exhaust all your options. So you've got as high as you can go with that company for the per diems. You have your taxable hourly. You got your travel reimbursement. You got your licensure reimbursement. But there's still like some little extra cash hanging out here. And they're like, well, what are we going to do with this? Are we going to put it back in your taxable? Well, you don't really want it to go back in your taxable, because then you're going to have to pay taxes on that. And even though they're paying the same amount, you now owe money for that money, and so relatively making less. So here are some other options that you can have for reimbursements, but usually this means that you'll have to provide receipts or something like that. There's different rules to play by for each staffing agency, but the ones that we see normally are CEU reimbursements. So you can receive reimbursements for the CEUs that you have. So hold on to those receipts, and then luckily, hopefully you can use them for a reimbursement later on if you ever run across this issue. Other ones I've heard of are scrubs that you can put forward and say, hey, actually for this hospital, I needed to get navy scrubs and I had all black scrubs, so here are my receipts, and you can get some reimbursement money for that for a tax-free option rather than it going back into your taxable hourly, since you're already, kind of receiving what was agreed upon for that staffing agency. Similar to the licensure reimbursement, going back to the licensure, you can have different rules between the staffing agencies. So it can be, you have to get that staffing license or that state license within 30 days before you start your contract, which can be a problem if you're going through California. It can take a while, right? Or if maybe there's they only pay for licensure if it's your first contract in that state. So if you have worked in the state before, left, come back, they're not going to repay for a licensure that you already had because it's older and somebody's already paid for it. So there are rules that you'll have to look into, and it does vary very differently between each staffing agency. All right, talking about bonuses. So this is something that I've actually changed my mind on a little bit when I first started. So when I first started, bonuses sound great, right? They sound great. It's like, oh, sweet, like all this extra money at the end for me doing a good job. Maybe it's a productivity bonus. Maybe there's a completion bonus, which sometimes it's just a marketing ploy. Sometimes it's just a hard facility to keep somebody there. Whatever it might be, there's a bonus at the end. There's this lump of money at the end that they're going to say, kind of like hold at the end for you and say, congrats, you finished your 13 weeks. Bonuses, depending on where they come from, are highly taxed, up to 40%. And I used to think like, oh, so that means like with tax, like with that bonus, I'm going to be losing money, right? Because if I'm getting tax-free money for my per diems, for my CEU reimbursement, for my travel reimbursement, and then this bonus option out there is highly taxed, or even just my taxable hourly, I'd rather have that bonus in the taxable hourly. Well, the bonuses, although it is taxed higher at the point that is given out, to my understanding, later on that year, you actually get that tax back because you're only allowed to be taxed within your respective bracket. Usually the one everybody quotes is within that 25% tax bracket. So if you receive this bonus and it was taxed at 40%, now you're in a tax bracket of 25%. You should be receiving that difference back, that 15% back to you at the end of the year. So that is something that has changed my mind. So it's not as bad. But I still don't agree with it because a bonus is still taxed. So if it's coming out of your paycheck as a traveler, if they're taking, $500, $1,000, whatever it might be, to put it at the end of your contract, then that money is now taxed. Whereas if you had the option to put that towards like travel reimbursement or maybe CEU reimbursement instead, now you're getting that money taxed. Another thing that kind of makes this a little more tricky is that sometimes the bonuses at the end aren't always offered by the staffing agency. So not always are they coming out of your money. Can actually be offered by the facility. So that's something important to ask is this offered by the facility? Are they paying it? Or is this being paid for by the staffing agency? Is this coming out of my bucket of money? If it's coming out of your bucket of money, don't go for it. It's taxed, and not only that, it's at the end of the contract, which is more likely to be prorated. If instead it was a travel reimbursement at the front of the contract, like you're going to get that money, you don't have to worry about it. They're not going to prorate that front amount. But bonuses in general, unless it's coming directly from the facility, try to negotiate that elsewhere instead of in a taxable bucket, similar to taxable hourly. So the next and kind of last item here to talk about would be overtime and extra time. And so you'll see these when you talk about them, if you're doing your homework, if you're reading up and you're like, what's the difference between extra time? What's the difference between overtime? And overtime is kind of a legal term. and extra time is a contract term. So what that means is that overtime is determined by the state, and extra time is determined by each individual contract. If, say, you are working in Missouri and you're doing 10-hour days, and you do 4 days a week, you hit your 40 hours, you didn't do any overtime that week. Now, if you take an extra shift the next day and you work 5 hours and now you're at 45 hours, now you are at overtime for that state, because it says anything greater than 40 hours a week would be overtime. In the case of California, anything over 8 hours a day is considered overtime. So if you're working 40 hours a week, you're doing 4 10s. Now, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, you worked 4 10s that week, but you're doing 2 hours extra each day of overtime. So that would be the difference between, like, you're still putting in 40 hours a week where it wouldn't be overtime in Missouri, but because you're in California, because anything over 8 hours a day is considered overtime, now you are doing overtime. And to make things a little bit more complicated, sometimes facilities can sign a waiver or something legal to say, hey, we actually regularly work over 8 hours a day, so we're going to step out of that inclusion for overtime. And so we've seen this with a traveler where thought he was going to be receiving overtime for that contract, and actually, because there was a difference between the last facility and this facility that he was at, that overtime didn't apply. So it's not as straightforward, and finding more and more often as we dive into this world of traveling that everything's gray. But usually, especially working with these big hospitals and stuff, in California, over 8 hours as of now would be overtime. So what's important to know, in extra time. With extra time, say that you are a nurse and you have three shifts per week, 12 hours a day, 36 hours. You decide to take an extra shift, or maybe you're on call and you come in for 4 hours. Now you're working a 40-hour week. Overtime wise, if in Missouri, you're fine. There's no overtime, but you would be doing extra time because your contract only said 36 hours a week. So that's 4 hours of extra time within that contract. So something important to know, that you should be compensated for those extra hours that you're putting in. But that is the difference between overtime and extra time. The reason that's so important is that extra time doesn't really have any rules around it. But with overtime, usually it's like 1.5 your taxable hourly. So they're going to times whatever you're making for your hourly wages. And that's going to give you, if you're earning, let's say, $20 an hour for taxable hourly, now you're doing some overtime hours, 1.5 times that would be 30 an hour. But if you're looking at this and you're like, oh, I added everything up with my contract, and when I was just, working the regular amount, and before I even hit overtime, I was making $42 an hour with all my per diems, with all my reimbursements and everything kind of included. But now that I'm doing overtime, they're only paying me $30 an hour. So I'm actually making relatively less per hour than I was on the original 40. And so what you're going to want to do is see if there's any negotiation room for that overtime, for that extra time, in order to make sure that you're receiving the same amount around the blended rate that you were receiving for those original hours. If you're curious what a blended rate is kind of like looking at your entire contract, so 13 weeks, you have X amount of hours for that entire contract. You're looking at the hourly amount that you're earning, taxable. You're looking at your weekly per diems. You're looking at your travel reimbursement at the beginning and at the end, and any extra reimbursements that you might have. Looking at all that, you're going to add it all together into the contract, add it all into a lump sum, one big lump sum figure. And then you're going to divide it by the total amount of hours that you have for that contract. And that's going to come out with one number, one solid figure that you'll be earning per hour. And when you are negotiating for extra time or overtime, you want it to be around that same amount. If it's not, if it's $12 less or whatever it might be, you're making relatively less money. It might not be worth it to, give up your weekends for adventure hikes and stuff in order to go on and work and kind of be the hero for the day. So you want to see if they can come up. There are some different ways that staffing agencies will handle this. Some will go higher on their taxable hourly multiplication. Again, that's a law for a minimum, but some will actually increase it by 2 times, maybe 2.5, in order to make sure that taxable hourly amount that you get as overtime does come back to you in the same total. But something to remember is that it will be taxable now, because it will be your taxable hourly amount. And so even though that they're paying the same amount, you're still kind of making a little bit less money, but that's fine. That's not on the staffing agencies, nothing that you can really do about it. It's just the amount that you're going to have to take taxed. What also we've seen is kind of extra time bonuses or extra time bonus shifts, and they will pay you what they're legally obligated, but at the end they will give you a bonus that'll equal amount up and around the blended hourly rate for what you're earning for that contract. So those are some different ways that staffing agencies handle that. Again, that's all per their legal team. It definitely is not as straightforward as I thought it was when I was first getting into it, but that is how to negotiate for extra time and overtime to know kind of what's fair. Some staffing agencies will go above the blended rate, which is cool. That's awesome. There's more money. Some staffing agencies will go a little bit below, and that's usually what you're looking for, within $2 of what the blended rate is. If you are kind of going through a negotiation process right now, there are 2 tools that I want to bring to your attention, and they're both calculators. And these are great ways for you to kind of just plug it in and see what the amount is for your blended hourly rate, so you don't have to kind of figure it out on your own. And the first one that I stumbled upon was with PAN Travelers, PAN Travelers. If you go to their website and you sign up for a membership, it's free, and you just take the free membership. They have a calculator that you can use, and you can figure out the blended rate. And it's pretty quick. There's not a lot of fields to enter, and you can enter it really fast. And so that was the first one, the granddaddy calculator. But the next one that I really, really like is the Nomadicare calculator, Nomadifare calculator. So if you go to nomadicare.com, you can go and check out their calculator as well. Nomadicare is much more thorough. It takes a little bit longer to fill out, maybe like 5-6 minutes. But they got sliding scales, and what's really cool about it is if you are new to this, it really shows you where you can negotiate, and it'll walk you through like more in detail what exactly is extra time, what exactly is overtime. And I really like that calculator just because it is so thorough. There's not really anything left to a gray area or a question mark like there is with the PAN Travelers, but they are both very excellent. And with the Nomadicare calculator, you can email yourself a summary for that breakdown. And so if there is room to negotiate, you can just send that to your recruiter, and they can see kind of what you're wanting out of that and where to move cash. And in the event of an extension, if you do extend, how much you should be getting around for the blended rate for that hourly pay. The big thing to know with extensions is that if you are receiving a reimbursement like travel, CEU, something other than licensure, you want to make sure that money is not just disappearing with your extension, that it should be going somewhere back into your extension. So if you got $1,000 travel reimbursement to get to wherever you needed to go, move that to an extension, you're not going to be making the same, taxable hourly and the same per diems. That $1,000 from that first contract should fit somewhere within that extension. Now that's thinking of the extension being another 13 weeks. If it's less than that, then you'll need to prorate that amount. You need to figure it out, which you can actually do with the Nomadicare calculator. It just makes it much, much easier. But that is the big idea for extensions, is that you don't want this chunk of change that was taken from your bucket to all of a sudden not be available to you for that extension, like what used to happen. So some recruiters, some companies would say, oh, well, you're not traveling to this assignment anymore, so you don't get the reimbursement, even though that came out of your bucket of money. So you want to make sure that $1,000 or whatever, that travel reimbursement, CU reimbursement, if it was coming out of your bucket of money, that it is still going to you in an extension, because you're extending at a facility. You did a great job. They asked you to extend, should be rewarded, or at least make the same amount that you were before. And so that is the basics of a travel contract. We kind of went through a gambit of them. This was a general overview. Each of these you could easily talk about for a while, but this is just kind of the basics of how to get started. Eventually we will kind of dive deeper into each of these, but this is what you really need just to be successful. And then as you kind of go down the rabbit hole, you can find out more and more and more. But I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of this first kind of actionable episode with negotiations. I appreciate you guys so very much. But if you're looking for the next episode of the New Medical Nomads podcast, you can find it on iTunes, find it on Spotify. Check it out. The upcoming episodes we always promote on Facebook, on the Facebook business page for New Medical Nomads podcast. You can also look at YouTube. Any subscriptions, any likes, comments, shares, hearts, let more people see it and let more people get this information. So that's the ultimate goal of this podcast, is to help other travelers. So if you guys could do that, we'd appreciate it. Yeah, it's good to be home. I'll be recording a couple more while I'm here at home, and you guys have great adventures, and everybody have safe travels.